My name is Lucas. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as a dependable man, a husband, a father, the kind of person who shows up, keeps his word, and doesn't make scenes. If you asked people who knew me back then to describe me, they'd probably say I was calm, practical, maybe a little quiet. Some would say I was lucky. Others might say I was invisible in the way reliable people often are. I've learned that when you're steady, people assume you're unbreakable. When you don't complain, they assume you're fine. And when you keep choosing peace over conflict, they sometimes mistake that for weakness, or worse, consent. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning an argument or exposing a villain. It's about a long, slow realization that unfolded over years, not days. It's about the cost of staying silent for too long, and the unexpected moment when the people I thought I was protecting finally spoke up. For a long time, I told myself a single sentence whenever things felt off. Stay for the kids. I repeated it like a vow, like a shield. I believed endurance was love, and stability was the same thing as safety. That belief carried me through more than I care to admit. I stayed married for the kids, until the kids asked me to leave. What follows is not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet unraveling. Small dismissals, normalized disrespect, roles assigned without discussion. None of it looks serious enough, on its own, to justify walking away, and that's exactly why it lasted as long as it did. There was no single explosive argument, no moment where someone slammed a door and everything became clear. The clarity came much later and much softer than people expect. It came in conversations whispered at night. In the way, my children watched me more closely than I realized. In the realization that they saw the damage long before I admitted it. This story moves slowly on purpose, because that's how it happened, because real emotional erosion doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly while life keeps moving. I'm telling this now, not to assign blame, but to tell the truth I avoided for years, to document what it feels like to wake up inside a life you helped build and realize you've been standing at the edge of yourself for a long time. If you're listening to this while questioning your own silence, your own endurance, or the stories you tell yourself to get through the day, this isn't advice. It's just one honest account. Take from it whatever helps. Leave the rest. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever stayed somewhere longer than your heart knew was healthy, simply because leaving felt harder than enduring? For a long time, I didn't think of myself as someone who could disappear. I was there every day. I paid the bills on time. I showed up to school events, even when I had to leave work early and sit in the back of an auditorium with a lukewarm coffee. I fixed things that broke. I remembered birthdays. I listened more than I spoke. From the outside, I was present in all the ways that seemed to matter. Inside the family, my role was simple and well-defined. Even if no one ever said it out loud, I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much. If something needed to be handled, it was assumed I would handle it. If something went wrong, I'd quietly clean it up. If emotions ran high, mine stayed low, and people found comfort in that. Friends used to joke that nothing rattled me. My wife would sometimes say, half smiling, "Lucas is easy. He doesn't get upset about things." At the time, I took that as a compliment. I thought it meant I was mature, balanced, safe. What I didn't understand then was that being easy often means being unchallenging, and being unchallenging makes it very convenient for others to stop looking at you closely. In conversations, I became the listener. Decisions were discussed around me, not always with me. Plans formed while I nodded along, assuming my agreement was implied. When I did voice a preference, it was often met with a quick acknowledgement and a pivot, like checking a box rather than opening a discussion. No one was cruel about it. That's what made it harder to notice. There was no obvious villain, no raised voices, just a slow pattern of my perspective mattering less. At home, I was described as low maintenance. I didn't argue when plans changed at the last minute. I didn't push back when my needs were postponed. I told myself this was what compromise looked like. Marriage, after all, was about sacrifice. Parenting even more so. I believed that if I stayed grounded, the family stayed grounded. The truth is, I was proud of how much I could carry without complaint. I built part of my identity around it. I was the man who could absorb stress so others didn't have to. The man who could wait. The man who could endure. But endurance has a cost when it's one-sided. Over time, something subtle happened. My silence started being interpreted not as patience, but as agreement. My flexibility became an expectation. My emotional restraint turned into a blank space that others projected onto. I wasn't asked how I felt about things because people assumed they already knew. Lucas will be fine. Even I believed that. At work, I was the dependable middle, not flashy enough to be noticed, not problematic enough to be questioned. At home, I filled the same space, useful, predictable, background. I was essential but not central, needed but not consulted. The strange thing is, I didn't feel angry back then. I felt tired, a quiet, persistent tiredness that I couldn't quite justify. Anytime it surfaced, I dismissed it. Other people had real problems. Other marriages were worse. My kids were healthy. My life was stable. What right did I have to feel dissatisfied? So I pushed the feeling down and reframed it as responsibility. If I'm honest, I also feared what would happen if I stopped being that version of myself. The calm one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't rock the boat. That role kept everything smooth on the surface, and I believed that as long as the surface was smooth, the kids were safe. What I didn't see yet was how closely they were watching, how much they were learning, not from what we said, but from what we tolerated. They saw me defer, they saw me shrink my needs to fit the room. They saw what I thought was maturity and what they felt as absence. Back then, I thought my job was to hold everything together quietly. I didn't realize that little by little, I was teaching everyone, including myself, that my presence was optional as long as my function remained. That was who I was to them, reliable, calm, invisible. And at the time, I thought that was enough. It's strange how clearly I can remember the first moment something shifted, even though it seemed insignificant at the time. There was no argument, no raised voice, just a sentence said casually, the way people speak when they don't realize they're changing something. We were in the kitchen, late afternoon. The kids were in the living room, half watching a show, half fighting over snacks. I had just come home from work, loosened my tie, and started helping with dinner out of habit. I asked a simple question about the weekend, something about plans that had been mentioned earlier in the week. My wife didn't look up when she answered. She said, "Oh, I already told everyone you'd be fine with it." That was it. One sentence. Nothing sharp, nothing cruel. Everyone else in the room accepted it without pause. The kids kept talking, the stove kept sizzling, life moved on, and I nodded, because of course I did. I didn't want to make it a thing. I told myself it didn't matter. It was a small decision, a normal assumption. That's what couples do, right? But something in me registered it differently. It wasn't about the plan itself. I honestly didn't care much about where we went or what we did that weekend. What stayed with me was the ease of the assumption. The way my consent was treated as a given rather than a question, as if my agreement was part of the furniture, always there, never needing to be checked. I remember thinking, she knows me, she knows I'm flexible, and that thought soothed me just enough to let it go. That's how the first small cuts happen. They don't hurt much. They don't even bleed. They just leave a faint mark that only you notice. And because no one else reacts, you start to wonder if you imagined it. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared. Tiny, almost invisible. Decisions made in advance. Jokes about how Lucas doesn't mind. Comments framed as compliments that quietly erased my agency. Each one on its own was nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name. I told myself I was being oversensitive. I was tired. Work had been stressful. Parenting was draining. It was easier to assume the problem was me than to examine the dynamic too closely. What made it harder was that everyone else seemed perfectly comfortable. My wife wasn't acting maliciously. The kids weren't disrespectful. There was no obvious conflict to point to, and without conflict, it felt unjustified to speak up. So I stayed quiet. I also didn't want to break the image people had of me, the calm one, the easy one, the one who didn't get hung up on details. Speaking up would mean redefining myself in their eyes. It would introduce friction. And I had spent years convincing myself that friction was the enemy of a healthy family. Looking back, I realize how much effort I put into maintaining a version of myself that required less from others. I made myself smaller so things could run smoothly. I told myself that was love. But that first small cut mattered because it set a precedent. It taught everyone, again, without words, that my presence was useful but my input was optional. And because I didn't challenge it, the assumption hardened quietly. The hardest part to admit is that I sensed it happening. I felt the faint discomfort and chose to ignore it, not because I was weak, but because I was committed to a story where endurance equaled virtue. That day in the kitchen didn't change my life. It changed the direction of it, and no one else noticed. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an exception. That's how I normalized it. Not consciously, not with bitterness, just quietly, the way people adapt to discomfort when they believe it serves a greater good. The assumptions continued. Plans were made on my behalf. Opinions are summarized instead of being asked for. "Lucas is okay with it" became a familiar phrase, said casually, even affectionately. Sometimes it was true, sometimes it wasn't. Most of the time, no one checked the difference. I started pre-adjusting myself before conversations even happened. I'd rehearse flexibility. I'd anticipate what was easiest for everyone else and shape my response around that. It felt efficient, less emotional labor for the family, less friction overall. That's what I told myself. When I did hesitate or express uncertainty, it was often met with impatience disguised as reassurance. "It's not a big deal. You always say that, and then you're fine. Why are you overthinking this?" The words weren't harsh, but they carried a message. Your resistance is unnecessary. So I learned to smooth it over before it reached that point. I also noticed something else happening. My silence was being interpreted as emotional stability, not suppression. People praised me for being grounded while I was quietly disconnecting from my own preferences. The more I adapted, the more the role solidified. At home, I became logistical support, schedules, rides, repairs, backup plans. I was the infrastructure of the household. Essential, but rarely acknowledged unless something failed. When everything worked, I blended into the background. And still, I stayed. I stayed because the kids were happy. At least that's what I told myself. They laughed. They did well in school. They seemed secure. I believed that as long as there was no open conflict, they were protected. I didn't yet understand how sensitive children are to emotional imbalance, even when it's quiet. I also stayed because confronting the pattern would mean confronting myself. I would have to admit that I'd been complicit, that I had taught people how to treat me by never correcting them. That was harder than enduring the discomfort. So I rationalized. I told myself that every marriage has imbalances, that sacrifice is part of love, that being the calm one was my strength. I told myself I was choosing this, even when it no longer felt like a choice. There were moments when the normalization became undeniable, times when my absence from a decision was so complete that it bordered on erasure, and each time I felt a flicker of something, resentment maybe, or grief, but I extinguished it quickly. Resentment felt dangerous. I didn't want to become bitter. I didn't want to keep score. So instead, I became quieter, more agreeable, less present in ways that mattered to me. What I didn't see yet was that respect doesn't disappear suddenly. It fades when it's no longer reinforced. And I had stopped reinforcing it, not because I didn't deserve it, but because I believed asking for it would disrupt the fragile balance I was trying to protect. Looking back, this was the stage where leaving would have been simpler. A conversation, a boundary, a recalibration, but I was still invested in the idea that if I just stayed steady enough, things would correct themselves. They didn't. They normalized instead. And once something becomes normal, challenging it feels like overreacting, even when it's slowly hollowing you out. Roles don't always come with announcements. No one sat me down and explained who I was supposed to be in our family. The role emerged gradually, shaped by repetition and reinforced by silence, mine included. I was the one who adjusted. If schedules conflicted, mine moved. If someone was overwhelmed, I absorbed the extra weight. If emotions ran high, I stayed calm, so others didn't have to. Over time, this wasn't seen as generosity. It became an expectation. I started to notice how predictably people reacted to me, not to what I said, but to who they believed I was. When I agreed, no one noticed. When I hesitated, it caused confusion, as if I were deviating from a script they'd grown comfortable with. That was the moment I understood something important. I wasn't being misunderstood. I was being understood too narrowly. My value had been defined by my usefulness, not my presence. I was the support beam, not the centerpiece, strong enough to hold everything up, but never meant to be seen. The most uncomfortable realization was that this role benefited everyone else. It reduced friction. It simplified decisions. It allowed emotional space to flow in one direction. And because it worked, there was no incentive for anyone to question it, including me. At home, I was the reasonable one, which meant my feelings were often treated as optional data. At work, I played a similar part, reliable, replaceable. I fit into systems without disturbing them, and because I took pride in doing things well, I rarely questioned whether the system itself was fair. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when I felt the words forming, ready to challenge the assumption that I would always adapt. But I stopped myself. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension, that peace mattered more than validation. What I didn't see yet was that peace built on erasure is temporary. The role I'd been assigned came with invisible rules. Don't need too much. Don't ask for recognition. Don't disrupt the flow. Be grateful. I followed them without realizing they existed. And then there were the kids. They learned early that Dad was the constant, the one who didn't change, the one who would always show up no matter what. On the surface, that sounds like a compliment. But children are perceptive in ways adults forget. They notice patterns. They notice who bends and who doesn't. They saw that my needs were negotiable, that my discomfort was manageable, that my voice could be softened without consequence. I didn't want them to learn that, but I did teach it. This was the part of the story where nothing dramatic happened, and that's what made it dangerous. Roles solidify in calm conditions. They harden when no one questions them. And once a role feels stable, stepping out of it feels like betrayal. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't plotting anything. I was still committed to making it work, still telling myself this was the cost of being dependable. But something had changed. I could feel the edges of the role now. I could see how little room there was for me inside it. And for the first time, I wondered, not with bitterness, but with quiet curiosity, what would happen if I stopped playing it so well. The day something shifted didn't arrive with drama. There was no argument, no breaking point that forced my hand. It was quiet, almost disappointingly so. That's how I know it was real. It was a weekday evening. The kids were doing homework at the table. My wife was on her phone, half listening to something I was saying about work. I stopped mid-sentence when I realized she hadn't heard a word of it, not out of distraction, but out of assumption. She already knew the ending, or thought she did. I didn't feel angry. I felt distant, as if I had stepped a few inches outside myself and was observing the scene from there. In that moment, I saw the pattern clearly, without emotion attached. I saw how often I was present without being engaged, how my contributions were functional, not relational, how my role had been reduced to maintenance. And for the first time, I didn't rush to justify it. I didn't tell myself it was normal. I didn't tell myself I was lucky. I didn't reach for the familiar defenses that had kept me comfortable for years. I just noticed. That noticing changed something. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, I sat alone in the living room. No phone, no TV, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of a clock. I tried to remember the last time I had felt seen, not appreciated, not thanked, but actually seen. I couldn't. That realization didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It clarified. It stripped away the noise and left something simple and undeniable. I had been disappearing in a life I was actively maintaining. I also realized something else, even harder to admit. I had been waiting for permission to take up space, permission to matter, and no one was going to grant it. That night, I made no declarations. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even change my behavior outwardly. The shift was internal, and it was subtle, but it was irreversible. I stopped seeing my silence as a virtue by default. I started seeing it as a choice. And if it were a choice, it could be changed. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention, not to others, but to myself. I noticed when I felt dismissed, when I felt tired in a way rest wouldn't fix, when I felt the urge to minimize my own reactions before anyone else could. I didn't judge those moments. I cataloged them. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I'd avoided for years. That staying might not be the same thing as protecting. That endurance might not be noble if it were teaching the wrong lesson. The kids noticed something too, though they couldn't have named it. I was quieter, not withdrawn, just less automatic. Less quick to smooth things over, more deliberate in my responses. Nothing broke, no one panicked, life continued. But inside me, a line had been crossed. I didn't know yet where it would lead. I only knew that I could no longer unsee what I had seen. And once you see a pattern clearly, you can't go back to believing it's harmless. That was the day something shifted. Not outwardly, but completely. After that night, my silence changed character. Before, it had been reflexive. an instinct to smooth, to adapt, to keep things moving. Now, it was deliberate. I still didn't speak much, but the reason was different. I was listening for patterns instead of avoiding conflict. People around me didn't notice the shift, and that made sense. From the outside, I looked the same, calm, agreeable, present. The difference was internal, and internal changes don't announce themselves. I stopped volunteering reassurance. I stopped preemptively explaining myself. When decisions were made without me, I acknowledged them without rushing to validate them. I let small silences exist where I used to fill the space. Those silences were uncomfortable at first, not for others, but for me. I had spent years making sure no one felt uncertain around me. Removing that buffer felt like neglect, even though it wasn't. What surprised me was how quickly others filled the space I left behind. Assumptions continued. Conversations moved on. The system didn't collapse without my constant emotional maintenance. That realization was sobering. It told me two things at once. I wasn't as essential to the process as I thought, and I had been essential to the comfort. Without my automatic compliance, there were tiny frictions. Nothing dramatic, just moments where things didn't flow as smoothly, and instead of stepping in to fix them, I let them exist. To anyone watching, my silence still looked like passivity, and I let them believe that, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I needed to understand what happened when I stopped protecting everyone from discomfort, including myself. I began writing things down, not accusations, observations, dates, phrases, patterns. It wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about grounding myself in reality instead of habit. There's a strange power in documentation, not as a weapon, but as an anchor. When you see your experiences written out, they become harder to dismiss. At the same time, I started making small internal shifts. I imagined what life would look like if I didn't automatically defer, if I didn't assume my needs were secondary. These weren't plans yet, just thought experiments. People continued to underestimate me, and that worked in my favor. They saw my quiet as compliance. They mistook my restraint for resignation. They assumed I was still the same man who would absorb anything to keep the peace. And in a way, I was grateful for that assumption. It gave me space. The kids, though, reacted differently. They watched more closely. They asked more questions. Not directly, children rarely do, but in the way they lingered when I spoke, or checked my face when decisions were announced. They sensed the shift before I articulated it. Not because I told them anything, but because emotional changes resonate, especially with those who are paying attention. I still didn't know what I would do. I hadn't reached a decision point. I was simply no longer asleep inside my own life. Silence, I realized, is only weakness when it's unconscious. When it's chosen, it becomes something else entirely. At that stage, it was my way of preparing, without rushing, without confrontation, without making promises I wasn't ready to keep. I wasn't withdrawing, I was positioning. While everything looked the same on the surface, something steady and methodical was happening underneath. Not dramatically, not obsessively, quietly, the way real preparation usually happens. I didn't wake up one day and decide to change my life. I started by paying attention to patterns, to numbers, to the way decisions were made and who they benefited. I began noticing how often I carried responsibility without authority, how often my contributions were assumed, but my limits were ignored. What no one noticed was that I stopped numbing myself to those realizations. I started learning, not in a panicked way, but in a grounded one. I read about boundaries, not as ultimatums, but as structures. I revisited financial documents I hadn't looked at closely in years, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I realized how little visibility I'd allowed myself. I organized, quietly. I reviewed accounts. I listed assets. I noted timelines. I made sure I understood exactly where I stood, not emotionally, but practically. Knowledge has a calming effect when you're no longer pretending everything will fix itself. At the same time, I worked on myself in ways no one could observe. I examined my reflexes, why I deferred so quickly, why I equated peace with silence, why I feared being seen as difficult more than being unseen altogether. There was no anger driving this, no desire to punish or expose, just a growing sense that I needed to stand on something solid, even if no one else noticed yet. And they didn't notice. My wife continued to assume my agreement. Friends continued to see me as the steady one. The rhythm of the household stayed intact because I didn't disrupt it. From the outside, I was still playing my role perfectly. but internally, I was detaching from it. I also started documenting interactions, not to build a case, but to break the gaslighting of routine. When something felt off, I wrote it down. When a pattern repeated, I acknowledged it. The act of recording turned vague discomfort into concrete data. And data doesn't argue, it just exists. The most surprising part was how calm I felt. Preparation didn't make me anxious, it grounded me. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting, I was choosing where to place my attention. The kids sensed it too, though again, nothing was said. They began confiding in me more, small comments, observations about tension they couldn't name, questions that weren't really questions. They were watching both of us, and I realized then that whatever I chose next would teach them something, whether I intended it or not. That realization slowed me down even more. I wasn't looking for escape. I was looking for alignment between what I said I valued and what I was modeling every day. What they never noticed was that I was no longer afraid of seeing the full picture. I wasn't rushing toward an outcome. I was building clarity piece by piece. And once clarity is built carefully enough, it doesn't collapse under pressure. It holds. The reveal didn't come as a shock. There was no sudden discovery that made my heart race or my hands shake. It arrived the way truth often does when you've been paying attention, quietly, almost politely. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the desk in the spare room with the notebook open in front of me. Pages of dates, notes, numbers, patterns that had slowly aligned into something undeniable. I wasn't looking for fault. I was looking for clarity, and that's exactly what I found. The realization was simple, and because of that, it was heavy. I had more leverage than I thought, but I had been choosing not to see it. Not power over someone, not a secret to expose. Leverage in the sense of options, stability, preparation, the ability to stand without collapsing if the ground shifted. I had built more independence than I'd given myself credit for, financially and emotionally. For years, I'd told myself I was staying because I had no real alternative, that leaving would cause chaos. That endurance was the only responsible option, but as I looked at the facts in front of me, that story unraveled. I wasn't trapped. I had been loyal to an image of responsibility that no longer matched reality. That was the private reveal, not that someone else had failed me, but that I had underestimated myself for a very long time. I had assumed fragility where there was actually resilience. I had confused patience with powerlessness. The clarity didn't make me happy, it made me still. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no urge to confront, to announce, to prove anything. In fact, the opposite happened. The clearer things became, the less I wanted to talk. Because once you know, you have options. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to bargain. You don't need to rush. You just need to choose. I closed the notebook and sat there for a long time, listening to the house breathe. This place I had held together so carefully. This life I had maintained without fully inhabiting. I felt a quiet grief, not for what I might lose, but for how long I had believed I deserved so little space within it. What made this moment different from all the others was that I didn't push the feeling away. I let it exist without explanation or defense. I let it inform me instead of frighten me. I also thought about the kids, about what they were learning, about what it would mean if nothing changed. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that staying might be the more harmful choice. Not because of conflict, but because of example. The reveal wasn't something I shared. Not then, not with anyone. It wasn't meant to be weaponized or dramatized. It was meant to anchor me. From that point on, everything I did was grounded in that knowledge. Not reactive, not emotional, just steady. I didn't know yet which path I would take, only that I was no longer operating from fear or obligation alone. I had seen the truth. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. There is a particular kind of moment that doesn't feel like a moment at all while you're inside it. No sharp edge, no clear before and after, just a gradual tightening, like the walls of a room slowly moving inward until you realize standing still is no longer neutral. That was where I found myself. For months, I had been observing, documenting, and clarifying. I told myself I was still in the thinking phase, still being responsible, still making sure I wasn't acting out of emotion. But somewhere along the way, the analysis stopped adding new information. The patterns had stabilized. The facts weren't changing. Only my tolerance was. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. Not choosing was already a choice. I began laying the options out honestly, without romanticizing any of them. The first option was to stay exactly as I was. No confrontation, no disruption, just continued endurance, framed as loyalty. I knew how to do this well. I had years of experience. The house would remain calm. The routines are intact. The image of stability is preserved. But when I imagined that future, 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, it wasn't neutral, it was quietly bleak. I saw myself becoming more efficient and less present, more functional and less alive. I saw my children growing older, absorbing lessons I never meant to teach. That love means shrinking, that commitment means erasing yourself, that being dependable matters more than being whole. I couldn't unsee that. The second option was confrontation. Honest, vulnerable conversations. Naming the imbalance. Asking, finally, to be seen differently. On paper, it looked reasonable, mature, adult. But when I stripped away the ideal version and examined the reality, I recognized the inertia. I had seen it before, in smaller moments. Awareness followed by effort. Effort followed by fatigue. Fatigue followed by a return to default. Not because anyone was evil, not because they didn't care, but because roles, once established, resist revision, especially when they benefit one side more than the other. I also had to be honest about myself. I had already spoken up in subtle ways over the years. Soft objections, gentle preferences, careful phrasing. They hadn't changed the structure, they had been absorbed by it. Confrontation might create temporary relief. It would not change the foundation. And then there was the third option. Leaving. For years, I had treated that word as synonymous with failure, as abandonment, as selfishness. I had told myself that good fathers stayed, that responsible men endured, that leaving meant choosing myself over my children. But when I examined that belief closely, it cracked. What if leaving wasn't an escape, but a correction? What if staying wasn't protecting them, but teaching them the wrong definition of love? Those questions were uncomfortable because they challenged the story I had been using to justify my silence. I didn't arrive at the decision suddenly. It formed slowly, like sediment settling at the bottom of clear water. Every time I revisited the question, the answer was the same. Not louder, not more dramatic, just more certain. Leaving wasn't the emotional choice, staying was. Leaving was the rational one. That realization startled me. I had always thought of myself as the calm, logical presence in the family, and yet here I was, recognizing that my continued endurance was driven by fear. Fear of disruption, fear of judgment, fear of being misunderstood. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being seen as the one who broke the family. That fear had kept me frozen far longer than love ever did. The real turning point came late one night, after a quiet conversation with one of my children. It wasn't dramatic. They didn't accuse anyone. They didn't ask me to leave outright. They asked a question instead. Why do you always say yes when you look unhappy? It wasn't said with blame, just curiosity, the kind of children who have when something doesn't add up. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't, because in that moment, I understood with painful clarity that they had been watching all along. Noticing what I thought was invisible, feeling the weight I believed I was hiding. They saw the damage long before I admitted it. That was when the decision stopped being theoretical. I realized that if I stayed, I would have to explain one day why I taught them that self-erasure was noble, why I modeled quiet resignation as maturity, why I chose familiarity over integrity. I couldn't do that. So I made the decision, not impulsively, not angrily, not out loud, but completely. I decided to leave. Not immediately, not recklessly, but irrevocably. Once that decision was settled, something unexpected happened. The internal noise stopped. The endless debating, the justifying, the second-guessing. It all went quiet. I wasn't relieved. Relief implies lightness. What I felt was weight, solid, grounded, undeniable. The weight of responsibility is taken seriously rather than avoided. I didn't announce the decision because I didn't need validation. I didn't hint at it because I wasn't looking for permission. I understood that once spoken, it would trigger reactions I wasn't ready to manage yet. So I held it privately. From that point forward, my questions changed. Should I leave? But how do I leave without causing unnecessary harm? That distinction mattered. I wasn't planning an exit fueled by resentment. I was planning a transition guided by care, especially for the children. I wanted clarity, stability, and dignity on the other side, not chaos. This wasn't about punishing anyone, it was about aligning my actions with the values I claim to hold. And once alignment becomes the goal, indecision disappears. I crossed the point of no return quietly, without ceremony. No one noticed, nothing changed on the surface. But inside, the path was set. Once the decision settled inside me, everything slowed down in a good way, not because I was hesitating, but because I no longer needed to rush. Urgency had always come from uncertainty. Now that uncertainty was gone, I didn't feel a dramatic resolve. I felt operational. I understood something most people don't until much later. When you've already decided, you don't need to convince anyone, not even yourself. The work becomes quiet, almost mundane. You stop imagining outcomes and start arranging realities. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. That was intentional. I still followed the same routines, same mornings, same responsibilities, same presence at the dinner table. I didn't withdraw affection or create emotional distance. I didn't want the children sensing instability before there actually was any. Sudden shifts frighten people, especially kids. And fear creates stories long before truth arrives. So I stayed steady, but internally I was moving with precision. I separated emotion from logistics completely. I told myself there would be time for grief, confusion, and conversations, but not yet. First came structure. Structure is what prevents damage. I began by reviewing everything I had taken for granted for years. Accounts, documents, timelines. Not because I suspected malice, but because I realized how much responsibility I'd been carrying without visibility. Knowing exactly where things stood wasn't about control, it was about clarity. I made lists, quiet ones. What needed to be handled before anything changed? What could wait? What absolutely could not be left ambiguous? I wasn't building an exit fueled by resentment. I was designing a transition that minimized chaos. One of the most important things I did was resist the urge to talk. That surprised me. For years, I'd internalized everything. You'd think once I decided to leave, I'd finally want to speak. But clarity doesn't crave witnesses. In fact, premature disclosure often complicates things unnecessarily. I didn't want opinions. I didn't want advice colored by someone else's regrets or projections. I needed clean judgment, so I kept my circle closed to myself. At home, assumptions continued uninterrupted. Plans were made, expectations voiced. My flexibility was still presumed, and I didn't correct it, not yet. I responded neutrally, neither affirming nor resisting, just acknowledging. This wasn't manipulation, it was containment. I understood that once the truth was spoken, it would trigger emotions that couldn't be controlled. Shock, fear, anger, bargaining. I didn't want those emotions tangled with practical instability. I wanted one problem at a time, so I handled the problems in advance. I ensured that whatever happened next, the children would not experience sudden disruption. Their routines mattered more than my need for immediate honesty. That was a line I refused to cross. And here's the part that's hardest to explain. Moving in silence didn't feel secretive. It felt respectful of the process, of the people involved, of myself. For the first time in years, I wasn't over-explaining or over-functioning emotionally. I wasn't cushioning everyone else at the expense of my own clarity. I was simply doing what needed to be done, step by step. People around me remained unaware, and that confirmed something quietly painful, how little they had ever looked beyond my surface calm. They saw steadiness and assumed nothing was happening underneath. They were wrong. The kids, though, they sensed it. Not fear, not an alarm, just a subtle shift. They lingered longer in conversations, watched me more closely when decisions were announced. There was a curiosity in them, not suspicion. I made sure to meet that curiosity with presence, not answers they weren't ready for. I didn't lie, I just didn't unload. I knew that when the moment came, they would understand more than I expected. By the time I finished preparing, there was nothing frantic left to do. No scrambling, no last-minute fixes, just a few conversations waiting patiently in the future. That's the thing about moving in silence. By the time anyone else hears the sound, you're already standing on solid ground. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was ready. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when you move carefully. They came in fragments. Small disruptions that didn't yet have a name. At first, there was confusion. I stopped automatically fixing things that weren't mine to fix. Not out of spite, not to prove a point, I simply stepped back from responsibilities that had quietly expanded beyond fairness. I still showed up, I still cared, but I no longer buffered every inconvenience or softened every edge. And people felt that absence before they understood it. Plans took longer to finalize, decisions stalled slightly, emotional friction surfaced in places where I used to absorb it. Nothing broke, but the flow changed. And when flow changes, people notice, even if they can't articulate why. My wife began asking questions, not directly, not yet. They came disguised as comments. "You've been quiet lately. You seem distant. Is something wrong?" I answered honestly, but incompletely. "I've been thinking." That was true, and it was enough for the moment. What unsettled her wasn't anything I said. It was that I didn't rush to reassure. I didn't minimize. I didn't immediately restore the familiar balance. I let the discomfort sit where it belonged. At work, similar ripples appeared. I stopped overextending. I clarified boundaries. I didn't volunteer to cover gaps that weren't acknowledged. And again, no one confronted me, but the atmosphere shifted. Dependence becomes visible only when it's no longer automatic. The kids felt it too, though in a different way. They sensed the household wasn't being held together by quiet force anymore. There was more space between moments, more pauses, less emotional smoothing, and instead of unsettling them, it made them attentive. One evening, one of them said, very casually, "You seem more here." That stayed with me. What people didn't realize yet was that the consequences they were experiencing weren't punishments. They were exposures. They were feeling the weight I had been carrying silently for years. And without that weight, things naturally shifted. Still, no one understood the cause. My wife began to feel a loss she couldn't name. Not abandonment, not betrayal, something subtler, the loss of certainty, the loss of predictability, the loss of a role she hadn't realized depended so heavily on my compliance. She tried to restore normalcy, more planning, more assumptions, more casual authority, and each time she was met with something unfamiliar from me, not resistance, but neutrality. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't complying either. That's when the unease started turning into anxiety. People often think consequences arrive as punishment. In reality, they arrive as an imbalance, as systems recalibrate when one piece stops compensating for everything else. And that recalibration is uncomfortable, especially for those who benefited most from the old arrangement. Still, I said nothing. Not because I was avoiding the truth, but because the truth hadn't fully arrived yet. This phase wasn't about explanation. It was about letting reality reveal itself without interference. The consequences had begun. They just didn't know what the consequences were yet. The shift reached a point where it could no longer be explained away as a phase. Confusion hardened into concern, concern into urgency. The system, our family, was trying to correct itself, and it didn't know how. That's when the reaching began. My wife started paying closer attention, asking more questions, suggesting conversations when things calmed down, as if calm had ever been the issue. There were moments of sudden tenderness, unexpected interest in my thoughts, and attempts to reestablish closeness through familiarity. To someone on the outside, it might have looked like an effort, and maybe it was, but it arrived too late and from the wrong place. It wasn't grounded in understanding. It was grounded in fear. Fear of loss, fear of instability, fear of a future she hadn't planned for. I could feel it in the timing. In this way, concern only surfaced once the balance shifted, and how the focus was on restoring normalcy, not examining what normal had cost. She asked me what was wrong. I told her I was tired. That was true. She asked what she could do. I said I needed time. Also true. What I didn't say was that time alone couldn't undo years of patterning. Not because I was unwilling to try, but because I had already tried, quietly, for a very long time. The hardest part was watching her search for the version of me that used to absorb everything, the agreeable one, the one who smoothed things over. She assumed he was still there, just temporarily distracted. She didn't realize he was gone. The kids noticed the change in tone before the change in words. They felt the tension, not as conflict, but as uncertainty, and in that uncertainty, they grew more observant, more protective of me in ways that startled me. One night, one of them said softly, "You don't have to stay if you're unhappy." They didn't say it as a suggestion. They said it as permission. That was the moment I knew there was no going back. Whatever repair might have been possible years ago would have required awareness then, not now. Awareness that arrived only after the structure was already destabilizing wasn't repaired. It was a reaction. I didn't feel satisfaction in that realization. I felt grief. Grief for what could have been addressed earlier. Grief for conversations that never happened when they might have mattered most. Grief for the version of our family that existed in theory, but not in practice. My wife began to sense the finality before I spoke it. You can feel when someone is no longer negotiating internally, when they aren't asking how to fix things, but how to leave cleanly. That realization brought panic. Promises were made. Apologies surfaced, general ones, unspecific ones. I didn't realize. I thought you were okay. You never said anything. All of those statements were true in their own way, and all of them missed the point. By the time you realize someone has been silent out of survival rather than comfort, the silence has already done its work. There are moments in life when repair is still possible, but only before clarity settles. Once clarity arrives fully, repair becomes reversion, and reversion is not healing. It was too late to fix it. Not because anyone was cruel, but because no one had been listening soon enough, including me. The conversation happened on a quiet afternoon. No raised voices, no audience. The kids were out of the house, and the space between us felt deliberate, almost respectful. I didn't plan a speech. I didn't rehearse lines. There was no need. When you've already made peace with your decision, words don't come out sharp, they come out clean. I told her I was leaving. Not dramatically, not as an ultimatum, as a statement of fact. She asked why. Not angrily, not defensively, with confusion that bordered on disbelief. As if the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. I spoke slowly. I explained patterns, not incidents. I described how I had felt unseen, not wronged. I didn't accuse. I didn't catalog grievances. I focused on the shape of our life, not the faults within it. She interrupted a few times, not to argue, but to correct my memory. I didn't mean it that way. That wasn't my intention. You should have said something. I nodded. I agreed where it was true. Intent wasn't the issue. Awareness was. I told her that I had said things, in small ways, over many years, and that when nothing changed, I learned to stop. That silence wasn't my first language. It was my adaptation. She cried, quietly, not theatrically. There was no villain in the room, just two people realizing they had been living inside different interpretations of the same life. She asked if there was anything she could do now. I paused before answering, not out of cruelty, but honesty. I told her no, not because she was incapable of change, but because the change she was offering now was being driven by fear of loss, not understanding. And I couldn't build a future on that. She asked if I had stopped loving her. I said I hadn't stopped caring, but love that requires disappearance isn't sustainable, and staying would mean continuing to teach myself and our children that my needs were optional. There was no shouting, no insults, no threats, just a long silence where everything that had been unsaid finally had space to exist. When the conversation ended, nothing felt resolved, but everything was clear. That's the strange thing about confrontations without heat. They don't burn things down. They simply reveal what can no longer stand. And once something is revealed that clearly, there's no need to fight it. Life after the separation didn't feel like freedom, the way people talk about it. It felt quieter than that, more grounded, less performative. There was no rush to reinvent myself or prove anything to anyone. I became more intentional about how I occupied space. I no longer rushed to fill the silence. I let conversations breathe. I listened without disappearing. I spoke when something mattered to me, even if my voice felt unfamiliar in my own ears. At first, that felt awkward. When you've spent years minimizing yourself, presence can feel like arrogance. I had to relearn the difference. My relationship with my children changed in subtle but important ways. They asked more questions, and not just about logistics, about feelings, about choices, about what it means to stay or leave. I answered honestly, without turning their mother into an antagonist, or myself into a martyr. I told them the truth, in a form they could carry, that adults sometimes stay too long in situations that no longer fit, and that leaving doesn't always mean abandoning love. They understood more than I expected. I also noticed how my body felt different, less tight, less braced. I slept better, not because everything was easy, but because I wasn't constantly overriding myself anymore. I didn't become louder or harder. If anything, I became calmer, more selective. I stopped trying to be liked and focused instead on being aligned. People reacted differently to me now. Some appreciated the clarity. Others were unsettled by it. A few drifted away, no longer sure how to interact with someone who no longer played the role they'd assigned him. I let them go. Not with bitterness, with acceptance. I learned that quiet strength isn't about endurance. It's about boundaries. About knowing when silence serves you and when it erases you. About choosing integrity even when it costs comfort. I don't see my past self as weak. I see him as loyal beyond his own limits. He did what he thought was right with the information he had at the time. And when he learned better, he did better. That's who I am now. Not someone who escaped, not someone who won, just someone who finally stopped disappearing. There's a temptation at the end of stories like this to offer a lesson wrapped in certainty, a clear rule, a clean takeaway, but real life doesn't work that way, and neither does this story. What I learned didn't arrive as advice, it arrived as a consequence. For a long time, I believed that being strong meant enduring quietly. That love was proven by how much discomfort you could absorb without complaint. That stability mattered more than self-expression. Those beliefs weren't born from weakness. They came from responsibility, from loyalty, from wanting to protect the people I cared about. But over time, they became incomplete truths. What I didn't understand back then was that children don't learn from what we say we value. They learn from what we tolerate, from what we model every day without words. They learn whether self-respect is optional, whether silence is safety, whether love requires disappearance. I thought I was staying for them. They saw that I was slowly leaving myself. And they noticed long before I did. There's no villain in this story, no dramatic betrayal, just a slow misalignment between who I was and the role I accepted. By the time I recognized it, the cost of staying had grown higher than the cost of leaving. That doesn't mean leaving is always the right answer. It means honesty has a timing, and when it's delayed too long, even good intentions can't undo the damage. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this: silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just unresolved truth waiting patiently. Quiet strength isn't about how much you can endure. It's about knowing when endurance stops being noble and starts becoming harmful. It's about choosing alignment over approval, integrity over familiarity. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I didn't leave to reclaim power. I left to stop teaching my children and myself that love requires self-erasure. And if you're listening to this while recognizing pieces of yourself in my story, I won't tell you what to do. Every life has its own context. Every relationship has its own complexity. I'll just leave you with a question, one worth sitting with honestly. Where in your life are you staying silent? Not because you're at peace, but because you're afraid of what your truth might change. If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not to debate, not to judge, just to understand how many of us are quietly carrying something similar, and what helped you finally listen to yourself. That's all.